Imagine being the closest confidant of a king. You are showered with power, luxury, and privileges that most could only dream of. You are the king's most trusted, the one who shares his secrets, his triumphs, and his failures. Your place in the royal court is unchallenged, your reputation untouchable. But what if one day everything you knew and loved was taken away in a single cruel twist of fate? This is the story of a man who went from being the king's most beloved to a victim of betrayal and vengeance that would seal his tragic end. It wasn't just the royal throne that held power in that world, it was the queen's gaze. And when her eyes turned cold, even the most cherished of favorites could fall. The royal court of the kingdom was a place of immense power and intrigue, where the favor of the king meant everything. He had many advisors, generals, and ministers, but none were as close to him as the man who had earned his trust completely. This man, let's call him Alexander, was more than just a confidant. He was the king's shadow, his most loyal servant, the one the king turned to when making crucial decisions. In return for his unwavering loyalty, Alexander was granted wealth, status, and privileges beyond measure. As the years passed, Alexander's influence grew. He had the king's ear, and he used that power to help the people and the realm prosper. The court, once filled with tension, now thrived under his subtle guidance. But as with all power, it didn't come without its enemies. The queen, who had once held a place of unmatched respect, began to grow jealous of the bond between her husband and his favorite. She had never understood the closeness between them. But over time, she began to feel the sting of being overshadowed by Alexander's growing power. While the king lavished attention and favors on Alexander, the queen was left to question her own standing in the royal court. Was she truly the most powerful woman in the kingdom, or had Alexander unknowingly usurped her? Their relationship, once cordial, began to deteriorate. Subtle hints of jealousy started to surface, and whispers of the queen's discontent spread throughout the court. She was no fool. She knew what Alexander's influence meant for her own position. As the tension between them grew, so did the queen's resentment. For weeks, the queen observed Alexander's every move, watching the way he moved through the court with the king by his side, always at the forefront of the king's decisions. The queen, who had once been the heart of the kingdom, now found herself in the shadows. She was no longer the sole confidant of the king, and it stung deeply. She had once been the only one who could bring him comfort, but now Alexander had taken that role. The queen confided in a few trusted individuals, her closest allies in the court. She told them of her concerns, her fears, and her growing hatred for Alexander. But in the eyes of those who still served her, the queen's desperation was nothing more than the jealousy of a woman who had lost her grip on power. No one dared challenge Alexander, not when the king had entrusted him with so much authority. The queen, however, knew that something had to be done. One evening, after a particularly lavish feast in honor of the king's victories, the queen decided she could tolerate no more. She had already overheard murmurs of a plan to weaken Alexander's influence in the court. But the queen's desire for his downfall would not be quelled with simple whispers and rumors. She needed something more drastic, something final. Late that night, in the silence of her chambers, the queen met with a trusted advisor. His name was Lord Darien, a man who had been by her side for many years. He was a man of ambition and cunning, much like the queen herself, and she knew that if anyone could help her, it was him. "Lord Darien," the queen began, her voice cold and controlled, "I need you to remove Alexander. I can no longer tolerate his presence at court, nor his hold on my husband." Darien looked at her with a calculated gaze, his mind racing. He had heard the rumors, but he knew that to act against the king's favorite was a dangerous move. He was loyal to the queen, but even he could feel the weight of this decision. "You understand what you ask, Your Majesty," Darien said, his voice low and measured. To act against Alexander, especially now, will mean the king's wrath. The queen's eyes narrowed. Then we shall do it in such a way that the king never knows. His hands will remain clean, and Alexander will be gone, for good. Darian nodded slowly, realizing the queen had a plan in mind. But what could that plan be? The king's affection for Alexander was unbreakable, and the thought of betraying him weighed heavily on Darian's conscience. Still, the queen was not one to back down from her desires, and her will was ironclad. "I will make the necessary arrangements, Your Majesty," he said, his tone laced with uncertainty but also a sense of determination. He understood the queen's mind better than anyone, and he knew that once she set her sights on something, there was no turning back. The queen's eyes darkened. "Make sure that it is done quickly, before the king notices." The whispers within the royal court grew louder as the queen's plans began to unfold. For days, the tension in the air was palpable, a feeling of foreboding hanging over every interaction. The king, blissfully unaware, continued to lavish attention on his favorite, Alexander, while the queen plotted in the shadows. She had already set the wheels in motion, and there was no turning back now. Lord Darian, loyal to the queen and fearful of the consequences, worked quickly behind the scenes. He made secret arrangements, contacting those who could carry out the queen's will without raising suspicion. The plan was simple but ruthless, a humiliating fall from grace for Alexander, one so thorough that even the king could not ignore it. It would be a public spectacle, but one carefully crafted to appear as if it were out of his control. The day arrived quietly. Alexander, unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon him, attended a private gathering with the king in the royal chambers. It was a moment he had enjoyed countless times before, an evening of camaraderie and trust. But this time, something felt different. There was a chilling weight in the air, a shift in the usual comfort he had come to expect. As he entered the king's chambers, Alexander was greeted by the king with his usual warmth and praise. However, there was a subtle hesitation in the king's voice, something unspoken, a heaviness in his eyes. The king, who had trusted Alexander with so much, was beginning to feel the pressure from those around him. He was being advised by his inner circle to distance himself from his favorite rumors and whispers of corruption. Manipulation and betrayal had started to surface. Yet, the king was torn. He had always relied on Alexander's guidance, his loyalty, and friendship. But just as the conversation was starting, the door to the chambers was flung open. A group of guards, led by Lord Darian, stepped inside. Their faces were stern, their movements deliberate. Alexander froze as he saw them, his heart sinking. He had known these men for years, trusted them. But today their eyes were filled with something darker, something that struck fear into his chest. "Your Majesty," Lord Darian said, his voice cold and commanding, "there has been a grave matter that has come to light. We must act swiftly." Before Alexander could react, the guards seized him, pulling him from his position by the king's side. Shocked, the king rose from his seat, his face pale. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Why is Alexander being treated in such a manner?" Lord Darian's gaze flickered to the queen, who stood silently in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. She had orchestrated every detail, in short, every step was carefully planned. She had anticipated this moment, knowing the king would be confused, angry, even hurt by the sudden betrayal. But the queen was beyond care for his feelings now. She had waited long enough. "He has betrayed you, Your Majesty," Darian said, his voice low but firm. "He has conspired with those who would bring harm to your throne. He has used his influence for personal gain, and we have proof." The king's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "This cannot be true," he whispered. "Alexander, my most trusted." His voice faltered as he turned to his favorite, the man who had stood by him through every challenge. But in Alexander's eyes there was no remorse, no shame. Instead, he seemed to be overwhelmed by the realization that he had been outwitted, outmaneuvered. The queen had played her hand with perfect precision. Alexander's eyes met the king's for the last time. "Your Majesty, I am innocent," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "I have always been loyal to you. Please, you must believe me." But the king, torn between his loyalty to his favorite and the mounting pressure from the queen and his advisers, hesitated. His silence spoke volumes. It was all the queen needed. She had won. The royal court had turned on Alexander, and there was no escape. The guards, following Darian's orders, dragged him out of the chambers. The king stood frozen, unable to make a move. The queen had orchestrated this, and the king was powerless to stop it. The next morning, Alexander found himself chained in the royal dungeon. Stripped of his rank, his privileges, and his dignity, the queen had given the orders. No one was to see him, no one was to speak of him, and his fate would be sealed with no ceremony, no justice. But the queen's vengeance did not stop there. She had carefully planned his downfall to ensure that his punishment would be both public and irreversible. The word quickly spread through the kingdom that Alexander had been dishonored and sentenced to death. The final blow came when Alexander was summoned to the royal court for his execution. The queen stood at the front, her face cold and unmoving. The king, standing by her side, looked weary, defeated, as if the weight of the kingdom and his decisions had broken him. Alexander was led to the scaffold, his once proud form now a shadow of its former self. His fate had been sealed by the queen's cruel hands, and he knew there was no escape from the punishment that awaited him. In a public display of dominance, the queen ordered that Alexander be castrated, his once powerful body rendered powerless in a moment that would forever mark him as the queen's victim. The king, his heart heavy with grief, watched as his former favorite was humiliated in front of the kingdom, but it was too late for regrets. As the crowd looked on, the queen's wrath was finally satisfied. Alexander was hanged in the royal square, his body swaying in the wind as a symbol of the queen's unrelenting power. No one would dare challenge her again. The king had lost his most trusted ally, and the queen had solidified her dominance. The aftermath of Alexander's tragic end was felt throughout the kingdom. The king, broken and alone, withdrew from court affairs. The queen, having secured her position, reigned supreme, her power unchallenged. But in the silence that followed, no one could forget the dark tale of a man who had once been the king's favorite, only to fall victim to the queen's cruel vengeance.